For years, we have heard nationalism screamed across the airwaves from CNN to Fox News to BBC as a major issue affecting the world. But at no point has there been a clear definition for what it actually is, and today we're going to seek to address that. My name is Dr. Alexander Mutnansky. I'm a political scientist specializing in international relations and nationalism, and today we're going to unpack this term, assess what it actually means in academic settings and how it's applied to the actual world, and what we should actually take away from this core issue affecting the world today and where we see it. As will be the case throughout this channel, I've included some key sources in the show notes for you to further your reading, and based on that, let's get into it. So what is nationalism? Before discussing nationalism, we first need to identify what a nation is. While this seems like a simple term and something we hear commonly throughout the news and in social media, it's often used incorrectly. At its core, a nation is a political identity. It's a group of people that come together and act for collective interests. This could be rooted in a shared understanding of history, shared ideals, values, and in some cases ethnicity, as we'll discuss. In many cases, this is often used as a synonym for statehood. But this is not, in fact, the case. While some nations may have states and become states, this is not guaranteed. So in sum, a nation is simply a political identity. We often confuse a nation with ethnicity. While an ethnic group can become a nation, that is not guaranteed. An ethnic group is simply a group of people with a shared identity, language, religion, symbols. But once that identity becomes political, they protest, they pursue collective interest, they pursue statehood, that is when an ethnic group becomes a nation. That is not guaranteed. In some cases, ethnic groups just exist within society. But once they are political identities, that is when they are a nation. A good example of this is the United States. People from different backgrounds come together with a shared language, shared values, shared political identity, all making up this big complex country that we know as the United States, which is in fact can be understood as a nation. Within that, there are numerous different ethnic groups because of the immigration history of the United States, making it one of the more fascinating cases of nationhood in the world. The unity that we see in the United States doesn't necessarily come from shared ancestry. While many people want to pursue that as a political interest, and we're seeing this a lot on the right, and we'll discuss this throughout this video, that is not, in fact, an accurate understanding of nationhood. It is this complex case where many people come together and they share a political history and they pursue interests for their kids. That unity doesn't come from a shared ancestry, but it comes from shared interests, shared understanding of what it means to be an American, shared institutions, shared belief that we can pursue a better life, all of which that kind of creates this nation of many ethnicities, many people from different backgrounds all over the world. Another interesting example is England and Great Britain. This is a complex, modern, and also a historical example of which an ethnic group can also be a nation, and an ethnic group and a nation can exist within a nation. The English are an ethnic group with shared history, shared language, shared culture, all of which that brings them together. Once that group becomes political, that's when it becomes a nation. But then on the other hand, there's the United Kingdom, this complex place which encompasses Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, all of which are their own ethnic groups with their own shared histories, historical languages, backgrounds, and complex settings that all make this state a very interesting place. Each of England, Scotland, Wales, all have their own identity. But what makes this interesting is that they come together under this one shared political identity of being British. You can be Scottish ethnically, you can be Scottish nationally, in which you operate politically through their own Scottish institutions, but interestingly, you can also be nationally British. Nations aren't always tied to a single ethnicity. They can also move around for themselves, and one person can have multiple national identities. Moreover, this complex instance of ethnicities and nations can even be further complicated by immigration, where people come with their own ethnicities, national identities, in which they take up the national identities that they adopt through immigration immigration. And this is what makes the world so interesting and so complex, and something that we need to better understand so we can push back against some of these false narratives about what nationalism actually is. What this shows is that nations are complicated. They aren't fixed. They develop over time, they change, and each individual person can have different understandings of what it means to be and what their own identity is and what their ethnic background is, in addition to their multiple national identities they might hold. And all of this operates in a political realm where moving pieces throughout all over the world, whether it's through immigration or dual citizenship, all create this complex environment that our nations aren't fixed, but they're constructed over time, and they happened gradually, and they change, and they're likely to change further in the future. Now moving to the concept of nationalism. At its core, nationalism is essentially the process and political elements of being a nation. It can be protests, it can be organizations moving towards statehood for a minority group. It's all these political parts of being and representing a nation and participating in politics. You can see this when people come together to build states or institutions, all in favor of the national interest that has been constructed over time. This can be a minority movement that seeks statehood or self-determination, a right of international law. The study of nationalism is quite broad. There's numerous different understandings, from modernism to primordialism to constructivism. And I know all these isms sound quite difficult. These are important because it helps us understand how nationalism is actually used today and how it's often used incorrectly and misunderstood broadly, and often is used to manipulate and outcast parts of society. One of the oldest and most well-known isms in the study of nationalism is that of primordialism. Brubaker, a famous scholar, essentially likened it to a dead horse in the study of nationalism, meaning essentially that it's fallen out of favor with scholars and is widely rejected. But this is quite important because it's often the lens through which many people in society actually view nationalism today, even though it's widely rejected and is misunderstood. So essentially, primordialism understands nationalism as fixed, almost something that's a natural part of society, something that could hypothetically develop through human evolution. But as you can imagine, nations aren't ancient phenomenons. They aren't fixed. They aren't natural. While politics might be a natural part of being human, nationalism wasn't guaranteed necessarily and is not fixed. This perspective has widely fallen out of favor with scholars because it underplays the real-world human interactions that happen to develop nationalism in nations. People like talking heads on the internet like your boy, or figureheads on Fox News, political figures, all help to construct and build this identity. It's not something that's natural or fixed. It's through human interactions every day. If you go out to the pub with one of your buddies, or you go into class and you meet friends, whatever, we kind of reinforce this through everyday interactions of understanding what it means to be, either through grouping ourselves in one nation or outgrouping others and seeing them as different nations. It's through these social interactions, this reproduction. And it's kind of understood as the constructivist approach of nationalism. And it rejects this fixation of ancient history that primordialists kind of would understand it as. But here's the twist. Even though it's fallen out of scholarship, we see it every day almost evoked as if nations are fixed or understood to be permanent or natural. You see people like on Fox News, they go out and they're spewing this garbage. They're trying to tell you that, to be an American is something natural. It's something that you're born with. But in reality, no baby's waking up and saying, oh, I'm an American. This is some statehood that you're given, some citizenship that you're given. And then as you grow up and over time, this is reinforced on an everyday basis. This isn't something that we're born with. This isn't something that our grandparents were born with. It's something that's developed. It's reinforced on a daily basis through social interactions or public reinforcement. And this is important, and this is where this story kind of, expands a bit. You see this understanding of nationalism creeping back into daily life, with right-wing figures kind of evoking this in a way to outgroup people.
So as we liberate our nation, we will lead it to new heights of victory and success.
And this is important because nationalism isn't something that's necessarily good or bad, but we're seeing it used poorly and often from a primordialist understanding of what it means to be a nation. And if everybody watching this can understand nations are not fixed or natural, we can push back against some of these framings that, some people that are born here, some people that look like this are in fact part of this nation, and in some cases superior as they're claimed in these right-wing movements. But in fact, these are social interactions. These are something that we developed over time and they're not fixed. And we need to push back from this understanding that nationalism is natural or only for a certain few. So while primordialism sounds like some old ism, some old theory that scholars like myself or scholars from generations ago bring up in academic settings, we actually see this used and applied today. And that's why we need to understand it, and that's why we need to push back against it. Nationalism can be used to bring people up, but it can also be used to push people down and to outgroup other people, and we don't want it to be that way. So this brings us to the first modern consensus that nationalism is a modern phenomenon, something that was developed in the post-industrial era with the printing press and further global interactions that helped to reinforce these identities. Through this, we can see this in everyday modern practices. If we go out, we talk about who we are, we understand our place in the world, we go online on places like YouTube where talking heads reinforce national identity and juxtapose them against other states or other groups of people, all of which are modern phenomena. This didn't happen in the pre-industrial era, and this is the consensus many scholars have right now. While there's been some arguments that there's something subjective about what modernity is, or how social interactions are, or how we understand political identity, this is generally the understanding that through the printing press, through the industrialization of the world, nationalism was built. Importantly, this shows that nations weren't developed overnight. This happened over generations. This was compounded. Through my grandparents and their grandparents, we've kind of developed this understanding that we as a people, through shared values, shared ideas, shared symbols, all are oriented around this group, and it's compounded over time, and it's not something that can happen rapidly. Notably, this counters the primordialist understanding that nations are fixed, natural phenomenons in human life, but in fact, it's just that we had access to further information. It's reinforced. National elites, politicians help reinforce this through the construction of symbols and such, but this isn't something that was inevitable. This is something that happens through social interaction. And that's important to see because that's how somebody can walk down the street and have multiple national identities, have a different ethnicity, and so on. And it shows that when people use the natural understanding of nationalism, it is actually wielded to outgroup people, to push people down, to say who is or isn't a part of a particular state. And we're seeing this weaponized consistently throughout the United States and in Europe. India, we've seen this as well. Japan, we're seeing it rising, and that's why this is quite important to discuss at this time. Now, while this might sound like an optimistic understanding of nationalism, as if we get to choose how it develops or who is included, it can also still be weaponized. We see politicians select key features of what it means to be a nation and weaponize it to implement policies that directly hurt people.
Questions like who gets to be a part of our shared society? And of all the pressing challenges that the nations represented here face, I believe there is nothing more urgent than mass migration.
So this goes to show that nationalism isn't necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, but nationalism, even if it's a modern invention, can be weaponized, and we're continuing to see that. Key examples of this were the First and Second World Wars, where we saw nationalist propaganda advocate for who is included and who should be outcasted. And we saw some of the most extreme and violent instances in history weaponize nationalism to serve the interests of the few and to hurt millions of people around the world. On the other hand, we see instances where nationalism can bring people up. Ethnic minorities can construct institutions, we can pursue states, and we can advocate for language rights, support culture, build cultural institutions, things that are beautiful parts of society. Nationalism can help fuel. While this can build up some, it can also push down others depending on how nationalism is used. And that's why it's important to identify when nationalism is being used to exclude or it's being used to bring people up. And we want to see instances of nationalism that support language rights, build culture, and make the world a better place. Another key approach to the study of nationalism is that of ethno-symbolism. I've used this in my own work, and I find it to be the most compelling explanation, and it can help give us some of the tools to understand how nations happen and what nationalism precisely is. While modernism believes that nations are products of the 19th and 20th century, ethno-symbolism believes that there's ethnic cores, roots to what these modern nations have been constructed. You can see this as a sort of an extension of a modernist understanding. Ethnic cores are something that happened before industrialization, where language was reinforced, symbols were developed, and then in the modern era, these ethnic cores, these symbols, these elements, aspects of religion have been used to reinforce what it means to be a nation. Through the work of Anthony D. Smith, the scholar that developed this approach, he saw these ethnic cores, these histories, as fundamental to modern nationhood and our modern understanding. And why I find this so compelling is that it gives us actual identifiable tools to see what reinforces nationhood on an everyday basis. And it can also help advance scholarship that understands how nations come to be. They use symbols, they use languages and religious norms to help reinforce these and help pursue collective ends to advocate for themselves. To juxtapose this against modernism, while the printing press might be viewed as a useful tool to develop nations and nationalism, it is these ethnic cores, these sources of identity that are needed to help reproduce this in everyday life and create sentiment on an individual basis. We can see this in our previous examples in the United States and Great Britain, where there were shared histories, there's shared language, and in some cases shared religion. And through modern inventions such as the printing press, we can publish these and reproduce them on a daily basis to show everyday individuals what it means to be a part of a broader community, a state, a nation. From my own understanding, I find ethno-symbolism to be the most compelling explanation. It helps to give us texture to understanding why nations come to be, what their identities revolve around, and actual tools to see nationalism in the modern era. Ethno-symbolism can help us understand the positives and negatives of nationalism. We can see how an ethnic minority group has a shared history, shared language, religion, and how they might want to build institutions and pursue an independent state. On the other hand, we can see how white nationalist movements, what are they drawing on to build their views of oppression? Some European ancestry in the white nationalist movements in America. While this is uncomfortable, we can see what they're claiming and then also use this to push back against that. We can redefine who's included in a nation and push back against oppressive versions of nationalism. Nationalism is the political process of a group of people coming together based on shared values, identity, all to meet collective ends, potentially pursue statehood, or advocate for rights. Nationalism, despite how it's spun online, is not inherently good or bad. In some cases, we can have bad actors that come together to oppress other groups, framing it in the national interest and framing what it means to be a part of a group. On the other hand, we can see groups come together and pursue political interests to further rights, advocate for culture, and things that we cherish in modern society. When nationalism is portrayed as something that's fixed or ancient or for a select few, that's when it's used to oppress. And that's why it's important to advance these discussions about nationalism and other isms to ensure that they aren't used poorly or to support the interests of select few. And as of right now, nationalism is on the rise. We've seen it discussed widely on a daily basis for decades now, in particular with the rise of right-wing nationalist movements across Europe and the United States. In places like Hungary, we've seen the rise of ethno-nationalist rhetoric, which seeks to marginalize people and determine who can be a Hungarian citizen. In places like China, we have seen the rise of national rhetoric around the Han identity, which seeks national unity and has been used to implement policies to oppress minority political movements, such as those in Tibet. This illustrates how identity can be used to enforce cohesion amongst a particular group and oppress others. On the other hand, in places like Africa, we've seen nationalist movements recreate borders and attempt to further rights for marginalized communities. Whereas in the United States, we've seen the rise of the America First agenda, which seeks to outcast immigrant communities and determine who is American. Understanding nationalism gives us the tools to push back against problematic forms. It helps us recognize when symbols, ideas, histories are being weaponized as a tool for policy that could hurt others. Understanding nationalism gives us the tools to push back against problematic forms and the tools to build up instances where nationalism can be used to build a better future. This channel seeks to unpack some of these complicated isms from academia, which are often misused in social media and the news. And with that, we can help to build a better political future. If you found this helpful, like, subscribe, and share with a friend. The more we know, the more we talk, the better future we can build. See you next week.